Hi folks, welcome back to the cabin. We're here today with Chris shooting a segment about two-handed rods and the science and the hopefully demystifying part of putting together two-handed tackle, rods, reels, lines, leaders, etc. The first thing that I'd like to say is that because you're a good single-handed caster won't necessarily relate to you being a good two-handed caster because they are very different. Has some of the same elements, some of the same forward power stroke, but that's about it. It was very confusing to me when I started back in the middle 80s, and for the most part I don't know of a single person that I have helped over the years, either in a regimented class or just out on the water helping folks out, that hasn't been really baffled and confused by how this is all done, including Chris. He's pointing at himself. So what this segment, I'd like to try and clarify a bit about this. We have a page on our website called The Mysteries of Fly Fishing, which I talk about this in text, and when I push that out there to the folks in the media world, I got 2 or 3 emails back. Chris and I were talking about it to say, oh my God, my head's exploding. And I get it. There's too many things that are different here to make it simple to relate from one to the other. But let's start. First of all, the idea of you having to spend a bunch of money to get into this particular side of fly fishing is not necessarily the case. There are so many good items, so many good brands out there today that are high performance at a price that you can afford. You don't need to spend $1,000 on a fly rod. That's number one. Number two, just so we start off at the baseline, I want to show you, this is a handle configuration of a single-handed rod, meaning you're going to put your hand on the cork just like this to cast it with a single hand. Reel goes here, sometimes a small fighting butt, sometimes not, but this is a single-handed rod. On contrast, here is a double-handed rod, and I'm going to show you the differences in those handles. Look at the difference. So right off the bat, we are radically different and somewhat confusing. Two-handed rods are just that. They are meant to be cast with two hands. I'm going to flip this 180 degrees, and I'm going to point this kind of at the camera to show my right hand is going to go up at the front part of the cork. My left hand is going to go on the aft part of the cork. This is where the reel sits. I'll put it together here in a few moments. And so you're casting it with two hands. That is essentially the difference between a single-handed and a two-handed rod. One of the other major differences is these rods are generally much longer than single-handed rods. So two-handed rods start in length at about 11 feet. Shortest one I think has been 10'6" and go up to, longest one I've seen is 16 feet. The average for two-handed rod casting today is in the neighborhood of 13 to 14 feet. So let's throw a dart at it and say 13.3 to 13.6 is about average for the two-handed rod. That's still 4.5 feet longer than most single-handed rods. So right off the bat, we've got something that's completely foreign to what I would call a normal fly angler that's used to casting single-handed. So the two-handed rod usually is 4 sections. Some are 3 section. Just simply from a travel perspective, they're long rods, so they're almost all 4 section. So let's talk about the designation on a Spey rod and what it may mean. This particular rod says it's an 8-weight, 13-foot 4-piece, and then it says it's a 500 to 700 grain window that this rod will cast. First thing is I want you to forget that this ever said an 8-weight, because an 8-weight is a 300 grain line, and all of a sudden the manufacturer says this is a 500 to 700 grain. So I want you to forget about that 8-weight entirely, not only on this rod, but on any rod. If it says 14-foot 7-weight, forget about the 7-weight, because if you go buy a 7-weight fly line, it's not going to work. Look at the grain window, and the grains are a measurement of weight, and it's going to take 500 to 700 grains to load and cast this rod properly. So that's the most confusing part about two-handed rods and what is technically correct for this particular power rod. This is a 13-foot 4, 500 to 700 grain window that this rod will handle. That's all you need to know. Because when it comes to a fly line, let's take a typical Spey line here. This is a Freightliner Skagit from Scientific Anglers. Nowhere on this box does it say that this is a line weight 6, 7, or 8. Doesn't say that. It says it's a 520 grain. So if we go back to the rod and we say the rod says 500 to 700 grains, and we've got a 525 grain Spey line, we're within the window of tolerance that this rod is going to cast and perform properly. Now, and that's all there is to it. It's as simple as that. Just throw away the old rod weight category, period. To take this a step further, now what we want to do is talk about what are you going to fish for? Are you going to fish on the surface? Are you going to fish a floating line, an intermediate line? Are you going to have a sinking tip on it? How are you going to fish, and basically what are you going to fish for? Most two-handed rods are used for fairly large fish. When I say that, a fish, let's say, in excess of 5 pounds. Most Spey rods are used for salmon fishing or steelhead fishing, sea trout fishing, those kinds of fish that are typically in the 7 to 10 pound category, some bigger, but typically in that category. So now the decision that you make as an angler is, okay, I've got this rod, it'll handle an 8 to 12 pound fish. I've got a fly line that says it'll handle a 500 to 700 grain Spey line. I've got a line here that says 520, perfect. But now we want to swing flies and we want to swing them subsurface. How are you going to get the fly down? There's 2 ways to do that. One, with a long leader. When I say long leader, 10 to 15 feet with big barbell eye flies, or lots of people, myself included, will use a sink tip that attaches to this fly line. Let's just take this one for example and what this might do. This is called T14. T14 means it weighs 14 grains per foot. So if we use a 10-foot length of this, we're adding 140 grains to a 520 grain fly line. Add the two together. If the two added together are within this 500 to 700 grain tolerance, you're good to go. If it's over that, it's going to slow the rod down and make the performance change. I'm not going to say it's going to be bad. It's just going to make the performance change. The rod will become slower. So depending on the type of line that you buy, the tip that you use, that's going to determine the combination of these two and whether or not it ends up in the proper grain window for the rod. Simple as that. Now, other aspects of this two-handed fishing and casting is that doesn't have anything to do with the performance of the rod from a casting perspective is the reel and the size of the reel and the size of the fly line. Spey lines are huge in diameter compared to single-handed lines or regular fly lines. I'm going to off-spool a bit of this just to show you. First, we've got the sink tip that's coming off from there. And now, here comes the Spey line. I want you to look at the diameter of the Spey line. It is huge. So, what does that mean? It means we have to have a pretty darn big reel to hold the capacity of that large line. This particular line, and the line that I prefer to use for casting distances, say up to 100 feet, is a Skagit line. And what is a Skagit line? A Skagit fly line is a line that was developed on the Skagit River, and that's a Pacific Northwest watershed, that dropped off very quickly, so therefore there wasn't the room to do this D-loop back cast that normally goes with a long belly type Spey line. So a Skagit line became very large in diameter and very short. The length of this line is typically 24 to 25 feet. So it is a very short Spey line, very large in diameter, and it requires a large reel. So on the front end of this Skagit line, you have then the options. You can see how it tapers down from very large to small right at the tip. You have the option then of adding at the end of this fly line sinking, or you can go like I do. I have in my vest an intermediate, or you can go full floating, or you can use the sink tip. So it's some of the old fly lines we used to call versatip fly lines, where you would have a floating, an intermediate, and a sink tip that you could just loop to the front edge of that fly line. This is exactly what this system is, only it is called Skagit. It's a simple system, meaning you can I use sometimes up to 12 feet of this T14 to get the fly down and make it swing properly. Sometimes if I'm fishing very shallow, I'll have an intermediate tip that may only be 50 to 100 grains of weight, and not have the density to take the fly down deep. It just depends on what you're going to fish for and water temperatures and the fly and how you're going to make that presentation. I would recommend that you get what's called a head wallet, where you can put different densities of sinking tips along with floating and intermediate tips, so that wherever you are, whatever you're doing, whether you're skating a fly on the surface, swimming the fly just below the surface, or dropping it down deep, you would have everything that you need in one of these shooting head wallets to give you that flexibility and versatility. So the Skagit Line, again, my preference, and it's probably the most popular line in the Great Lakes region. Behind the Skagit Line, back here, we have a shooting line. This happens to be my preference, which is 40-pound mono. I buy it in these spools. This is the Trilene Big Game, 40-pound. Shoots very well. It's very inexpensive, readily available, not only here at our fly shop, but other places. You can also buy a shooting line. Scientific Anglers and other manufacturers make these lines. These lines are great. They don't carry as well as the monofilament as far as its shootability, but they're great for handling. They're a little bit larger in diameter, and so a lot of people like them versus the mono. I'm a mono guy, and that's just who I am. So there's a variety of things that you can use as the shooting line behind the head. These lines are all cast with the entire fly line right at the tip of the rod. So whatever you have behind it as a shooting line, it's a line management thing. So it loops well in your hand, it doesn't tangle easily, and it's durable. And so that's kind of what those shooting lines are. The last thing in the setup on the shooting line to the fly line to the sinking head, the last thing we do is the tippet. Typically, when you're swinging a fly and making that presentation, fish are not leader shy. And so we typically use some pretty heavy stuff. Heavy stuff means 15, 16, sometimes as high as 20-pound test leaders. It's not necessary here, particularly if you're using a sink tip, to use a tapered leader. In fact, we recommend that you don't. What we do is we will use 24 to 30 inches of tippet material. We will tie a surgeon's loop or a perfection loop on the end, so we'll just quickly tie a surgeon's loop here, twice through the loop. Snip the tag, and you loop to loop then the leader material, and then your fly is at the end of this 24 to 30 inch piece. You have to keep the leader short when you're fishing sink tips, because if you have a long leader, here's your sink tip, but here's your fly. So by keeping the leader short, the leader follows the depth of the sinking line rather than bellying way up in the current. So keep the leader short, 24 to 30 inches, 15 pound to 16 pound is perfect. Land a lot of fish, gives your fly a lot of action. That's the leader. The system itself is not very complex. It is just confusing. And confusion leads to, I'm not so sure I want to do this, or, that's a lot of dough for something I'm not completely sure about. And so, what I would suggest is, if you haven't stepped into the game, talk to somebody, take a casting lesson, see about it, see if it's something that you would like. I will tell you this, that what it has done for me and done for most fly anglers is offered them up another opportunity and another technique that is, quite honestly, pretty damn exciting. Two-handed fishing is, first of all, you get distances that are almost impossible to achieve on an average cast with single hand fishing. Secondly, I'm just going to tell you this up front, us older guys, it's a complete rest of your shoulder and upper body. And for those of us who have shoulder issues, back issues, the two-handed rod is the ticket, because it just takes this motion that you're used to in single-hand rod and takes that away from you and gives you a more comfortable tool to cast with. And then covering water, there's nothing that covers more water than a Spey rod with a Spey cast, because of the distance and the swing that the fly gets in its travel as it swings into the current. So it takes fly fishing to another level. And there isn't anybody that hasn't come into this world that has spent time with it that hasn't said, boy, that is magnificent. We marvel at our casts, at how far they go. We feel a sense of pride when we make a good cast. And you know, that's part of the same as you do in single handing, right? You make a great cast and say, man, that's a great cast. Same thing in two-handed rods, only it's further and you get more opportunities at fish because the fly is in the water longer. So Spey, two-handed, it's simple. Help yourself by revisiting the grain weight window on the rod, making sure that you keep it simple, keep it clean. If you have trouble, call me. You can go to our website at SSoutdoors.com. We have, not only this video will be there at the site, but also the text that may help you along your path on this two-handed rod business. Thank you for the time, and we appreciate it, and stay tuned. We're going to be talking about other gear and other segments as we move along in this video world and presentations that we're doing on our website.